So our final snippet for this week looks at the end of the Wilsonian period. Wilson comes back to the United States after having negotiated the treaty in Paris. More than one-third of the Senate, all but one of them Republicans, James Reed, the Democratic senator, signs on to a document saying that they will not ratify the Versailles Treaty in the form that Wilson negotiated. They want amendments called reservations to the treaty that would require the assent of the other major countries that signed the treaty. Wilson does not want this at all. He is very confident in his ability to persuade the public, his oratorical gifts. And so he announces that he's going to go on a national speaking tour, going to the various states represented by his Senate opponents as a way of rallying public opinion to hopefully pressure these senators and persuade them to change their mind. This was not a good idea. Wilson simply should have negotiated with his critics. Wilson is also not in good health. He had suffered a series of minor strokes during his time as president. They seem to have been undiagnosed. During his speaking tour, he suffered, which is a grueling tour. He's traveling by train to the Rocky States, to the West Coast. It's a tough trip. He suffers a stroke and then a very serious stroke, a second stroke, and he's rushed back to D.C. He's incommunicado for several months. His wife is basically the acting president of the United States, and he is left paralyzed. He should have resigned, but he does not. The Senate nonetheless considers the Versailles Treaty 3 times. The first is a measure to ratify Wilson's treaty as is. The Democrats vote in favor of this, but the irreconcilables, the reservationists, the peace progressives all vote no. Then there is a second consideration to ratify the treaty with Republican reservations. Some of the Republicans vote in favor of this, but all of the Democrats vote no. And then there was a third attempt in March of 1920 to ratify the treaty with reservations. Some Democrats defect, but not enough. And although a majority favors the treaty, 49 to 35, remember, to get confirmation, you need 2/3 of the Senate, and this the League doesn't have. So the U.S. ultimately does not join the League, and it never will join the League. This causes problems, to put it mildly, in the 1930s, although as we'll see in the 20s, the U.S. cooperates a lot with League of Nations action. This chart gives you a sense of basically Wilson's problem with the League. Wilson controls the votes of 47 senators, Democrats who support, who consider themselves supporters of Wilson. One of these 47, a Massachusetts senator named David Walsh, occasionally does defect. Wilson's problem, though, is that the other factions are not easily assembled. So he has, there's one Democratic irreconcilable, firm opponent of the League, that's James Reed. Then there are around 15 Republican irreconcilables, people who say they're never going to vote for the League. Then there are 20 who are Republican strong reservationists. That is, that they want substantial changes in how the League of Nations is structured, especially the collective security provisions. And then there are 12 so-called mild reservationists, Republicans. They want minor changes to the League. Wilson won't even negotiate with them. But Wilson's problem is that even if he attracted the votes of the 12 mild reservationists, which he does not, 59 would not have been a 2/3 majority in the Senate. He needs some of the strong reservationists. So ultimately, the numbers just aren't with Wilson as long as he is refusing to make meaningful compromises, and he won't make any meaningful compromises. As a result, the League of Nations goes down to defeat. Wilson's end of term features problems elsewhere. There's a border war scare with Mexico in 1919. Also in 1919, there is a revolt in Haiti against continued U.S. Military intervention, headed by this man, Charlemagne Perrault, who was eventually captured by Americans and is publicly executed. It's a very, very gruesome scene, and a reminder of the gap between this sort of high-minded self-determination principles that Wilson articulates and the realities on the ground of his foreign policy. The Haitian episode plays a role in the 1920 presidential campaign. The Republicans nominate this man, Warren Harding, a Republican senator from Ohio. The Republican Party is deeply divided. They were going to nominate Theodore Roosevelt, but he dies in 1919. The party is split between a bunch of factions. Harding is the compromise candidate. He looks like a president. He sounds like a president. He's not the most ethical man. He's not the brightest bulb in the world, but he's acceptable to all factions within the Republican Party. Wilson considers running for a third term, but ultimately his health prevents him from doing so. The Democrats nominate the governor of Ohio, James Cox. So the 1920s is an odd presidential election in which both the Democratic and the Republican nominees are statewide elected officials in the same state. Harding is a senator from Ohio. Cox is the governor of Ohio. To try to appeal to Republican votes, the Democrats nominate Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as their vice presidential candidate. FDR had served as Undersecretary of the Navy under Wilson. This is a pretty slim credential to be vice presidential candidate. Republicans attack him for not being qualified, and trying to respond to that on the campaign trail, FDR asserts that he has written the new Constitution of Haiti. The Navy Department was in charge of the Haitian occupation, and he says that it seems like a good document to him. This arouses controversy. Harding denounces it. He says he's not going to allow this kind of imperialism if he's elected president. Spoiler alert, he does. More to the point, the newly created civil rights organization, the NAACP, criticizes FDR, and the head of the NAACP, an activist named James Weldon Johnson, campaigns on Harding's behalf. And there is this sense among the NAACP that Black Americans have a particular responsibility to stand up for the rights of the Black citizens of Haiti who are being oppressed by the American military occupation. The Democrats promise that they are going to join the League of Nations if Cox wins. Harding says he's going to join an association of nations. No one knows what this association of nations is. He never says. He's trying to appeal both to pro and anti-League Republicans, and he's able to do so. The result is a massive repudiation of Wilson. One of the southern states, Tennessee, defects for the Democratic Party. Republicans win everywhere in the country outside of the South. Cox barely gets 1/3 of the popular vote, a huge diminution in Democratic support. And you can see if you compare the maps. Here's the map of 1916. This is Wilson's successful re-election. Look at all of the states that go from blue to red between 1916 and 1920. So Wilson has been repudiated by the public. The new president, Warren Harding, has promised a non-Wilsonian foreign policy, although he's very, very short on specifics. And when we return in the next snippets next week, we'll be looking at how this all plays out in the 1920s.